So I want to talk a little bit about, well, what do we actually mean when we talk, why did I use the term enterprise? Because a lot of you are actually publishing out deep content out into the web. There's some differences between externally published deep content and internal enterprise search, but there's also some similarities, and so I wanted to be able to sort of think about both, because a lot of what you do also involves internal use of your content. Talking then about a little bit about indexing and relevance, the user interactions, then sort of stepping back and saying, what does it mean to actually apply taxonomies into this in order to make all those other things happen, and then round out with a couple things on feedback loops. And you're going to keep me on time, right? Excellent.
That feedback loop is working.
Excellent. All right. And if anybody has any questions along the way, just raise your hand, shout them out. We'll kind of take this as a conversation. So we want to talk about things like the attributes of the content, what it means to do searching and browsing, and then where the taxonomy plays a role in that. So within enterprise and deep site content, we have, first of all, user profiles where they're actually pretty highly motivated to be down in the depth of that content. They're knowledgeable or more knowledgeable than you would think, for example, in some of the more general public sites. And typically their experience is longer term. They tend to be more longitudinal, multiple sessions, deeper research, longer session times, things like that. The content itself is usually larger, and therefore it's sometimes harder to know what inside of it is actually most relevant. There are more subjects covered, and in many cases, a lot more repeated information. Now you see that more inside the enterprise than with large content sites, but there's often a lot of referencing and quoting, and particularly when you get inside organizations, there's a lot of reuse of content in there. And so you end up with information that makes it, again, a little ambiguous where the key focus in certain content is. So search and browse work together. What you actually have in all of these cases is underlying structure, even when you're searching. So you run a search, you get a list. But sitting behind that list is an underlying structure. So the way I like to think about it is thinking about it in neighborhoods. So there are various experiences where what people are looking for is not necessarily a single thing, but they're looking for sets of things that feel right in a neighborhood. And so what we're trying to do is not necessarily say, here is the thing, the I feel lucky type of thing. It's more of, yes, I'm in the right place. So working with scientists and various types of science and engineering search projects, one of the things we found is that their sweet spot is very often 20 to 30 items. So they're looking for sort of 20 to 30 articles at a first skim, and they begin to collect them up. You've all seen it, little tabs along the top as they begin to collect them up. And then they go in and they do iterative evaluation, and they learn something about how to search, and then they go back through the search process again, partly because of this idea of sort of finding the neighborhood they actually want to be in at a deeper level. Your taxonomy then is actually that road network. So whether it's starting someplace and browsing through certain things to get to know the structural landscape of where you are before beginning a more targeted search within a neighborhood that you want, or going the other way and saying, let's see what's out there, let's search for something that I might be interested in, and that will trigger me to then begin a more browsing experience. So search and browse are really very tightly complementary and really should be thought of as part of the same experience. The taxonomy also has to be more than just, here's a bucket full of words that I'm dumping into a black box and let's see what happens. So again, what we want to talk about is how you actually leverage the structure inside of the search and browse experience in your applications. So now we're going to get into the weeds a bit, not too much. So when we start looking at how to actually apply our taxonomies, what we have here in these hierarchical structures is usually, here's an explicit tag, and then there's this set of relationships around that tag that are both ancestors and dependents. And so our explicit tag will have peers that will tell us certain things. They will also have implicit children and grandchildren, implicit parents and grandparents. Done a project once where we actually use these, leverage them very extensively for ranking. And so what would happen is, and I will say I am totally not advocating in any way, shape, or form that you should manually store hierarchy inside of documents. Bad idea. Do not instantiate your taxonomy inside of your documents. But letting the search engine do that as part of the indexing process gives you the ability to weight different levels of semantic distance from where you are. And so that way, if something is tagged explicitly and then the user is looking at something at a higher level of generality, you can really begin to bring back those levels of specifics underneath it at a particular weighting scale. Likewise, if the user is targeting something very, very specific and you're tagging up above that, you actually want sort of less weight going up the scale than you want coming down the scale, but you want to be able to apply both in both directions. And what that means is if somebody's really looking deeply for something, it'll be in the results set. It means you get more results, it's bigger, it's broader, but what you get somewhere at the tail of the results set is more information that somebody might be looking for. And it means that when the facet filters come back, they're also able to target into it faster because they're beginning to see it within that. The same is true for related, but everybody's content is going to be different about how you handle things like related terminology and what kinds of semantic weighting you give to those kinds of things. The other thing is then thinking about relationship modeling. So how do we look at our subjects in relation to the context in which the subjects are in? And we talked a little bit earlier in the breakout session about the relationship between, internal terminology, what is this document about, what's the metadata that's inside the document, but then what's the external context in which it's applied, and how do we want to think about that? And so building out, as I know, Travis was talking today, about what they did with ASCO, asking a lot of information about, what your interest areas are, what your role is, what type of area you work in, and that's what I can call conditional boosting. So what he had in that great slide with that monster search index is essentially a form of conditional boosting, where you're saying if this parameter within your personalization is at play, then it's going to change your rank weighting of other things because they have this relationship. And huge shout out to the Access Innovations folks, link the SORI. I've been asking for this for 2.5 years. You guys are great. I am so thrilled to see this in a product now. Because this is where you can build individual structured vocabularies for individual focus areas and have them crosswalk at a fairly deep level as something more than just related terms. So having that in there gives you the first steps into personalization out of the box, really. It's just awesome. I just love this. So I think this one's got a lot of potential, but you have to really think, again, about how is it that people are going to be using an experience and thinking about these things. That will also get into questions of disambiguation, and we often use facet filters to deal with disambiguation, but where you have, for example, author names and subject names and subjects that are implied in descriptions versus in titles, etc. Again, again, you can begin to start thinking about how to bring things to the surface through this idea of linking different thesauri together and mapping them at closer levels. So this is something that we're only beginning to sort of think through what the interfaces would be to apply that kind of thing. But, where do you get enough context signals to actually allow the idea of the disambiguation to be able to happen? But it's something to really think about as we move forward in how to present this information. I'm a big fan of beginning to introduce small, lightweight visualizations, whether they're spark lines or small other types of mapping style visualizations into search UIs and into browse UIs, so you're always maintaining a bit of context of what you have. On the filtering side, with user interactions, filtering and related content are two areas that I think we want to be thinking about and exploring. So this is not for reading and digesting now. As I said, this is something you can go back to. But taxonomies play a role in a number of different areas. And as you start making decisions around how you're designing for your content to appear, you want to think both in terms of user-facing and the way the internal engines then use that information. So on the user-facing side, being able to present things like topical browsing, faceted filtering, preference selection and setting, recommendation. In the background, the way you're doing your relevance ranking, algorithmic tuning around personalization. So once you build profiles of people, you begin to match those profiles as patterns against the content that you have. So these are just some things to think about, because a lot of times we're either thinking about, well, the taxonomy is going to be user-facing and it's going to be out there and we need to design it from that perspective. Or it's entirely back-end and it's going to enable a bunch of things, but people really aren't going to see all that structure and that terminology. There's actually room for both. We've been working with one client now where we're actually looking at how the taxonomy has an internal structure which is used for its automatic classification and its work with the engines underneath. But then we target specific branches and elements of it to potentially draw out and present to the user. Another area that we've been looking at is, again, how to present things to users. So work that we did with the Optical Society on integrating their taxonomy into their user interface. The topics taxonomy was particularly tricky, so it goes down 7 levels. They wanted to keep the facet filtering from becoming too complex. And so when you're actually working with the facets, you're working in a strict hierarchical manner. So if I'm just selecting one, it's taking me down through hierarchy in selection. But if I want to get a richer experience by selecting, I want more items out of my topics facet, then what you get is the ability to now introduce, introduce the multi-select and multi-select across the levels of the hierarchy. But that's actually a somewhat simplified taxonomy because they looked at both where the content was applied, or where the taxonomy was applied to the content, and also what were the most recognizable terms to bring people into the neighborhood that they wanted to be in. And so it was simplified down in order to make the experience one that could be easily digested fairly quickly within the search process. So another thing then is thinking about related content. And increasingly I'm using search engines and as ways of generating related links. rather than having to write separate queries independent of the tuning that we're doing with search engines. We're trying to sort of balance it and see if we can achieve both. Because that way, if somebody says, yes, this is interesting and I want to go see that thing, they can see it. But if they say, this is interesting and I want to see things like this, then they're probably going to get thrown out to search rather than, again, writing a separate query infrastructure on your repository. And so in this case, then, we've been looking at how do we take the different elements of the taxonomy, the classification schemes that they have, and decide sort of what order do they digest in, and what attributes are we looking for specifically to make sure that, in this case, an archive site, so this site is very image-rich, but image-rich where, you know, there's 10,000 images of guys and horses and, you know, and the Texas prairie and that kind of thing. And there's also 1,400 hours of audio oral history. And so when you're looking at things like audio, and you're looking at things like pictures and images, and you're looking in some cases at archival objects that are large, where they have many pages in them, but you're looking at the object level, it's really hard to figure out what the algorithms are to drive related links, related content. And so we've been looking at the way the classification scheme can be balanced and tuned with a set of rules that will be able to be generated back in. And of course, you know, we can't talk about the user experience without talking about the different mental models and such around search. And some of you who were here last year have seen this slide before, but there's different motivations and experiences and structures that people have when they approach things like searching and browsing. And so down the bottom, there's a URL to a talk I did a few years ago, which includes a section on how people think about it, the different mental models, and what that means in terms of where you apply your optimizations. So leave it at that, but there's a number of things in there. So what does all that mean for how we apply our taxonomies? Doing that right on time?
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I'm watching your slide numbers.
Not that many more.
I know.
So, so we want to think about some ways that we have to address the issue of applying taxonomies. And this is not going to get down into the underlying mechanics of the rules bases and automatic tagging that we're seeing in the Access Innovation stuff, but just thinking about it conceptually when you're talking to editors, when you're talking to catalogers, when you're talking to other people. So again, if we have hierarchies, then very often what you get from people who are not as experienced with classification might be, well, you know, my content's about this stuff, and so I want to make sure that these high-level terms are represented, or people might not be able to find things generally. And as we talked about before, inheriting the hierarchy into the indexing and navigation sort of helps with some of that. As we look at then what the article is really about, and also it mentions these other things briefly, what we're doing is saying, rather than lumping these into a big bucket of subjects at the content level, in the curatorial process, let's think about what are things about, and then what is actually physically depicted. And that depiction might be a mention in the case of audio archives. It might be a foreground depiction and then a background depiction. I did a search on an archive recently for cars and found a picture of a guy and his dog in front of a church. It was great. And way in the background, there was a car on the street. So for an archivist who's looking at the history of the automobile, that might be of interest. But for most people who are looking at that, that's not what they're paying attention to. And so we felt by breaking down this structure into a three-part structure to store the classifications, it gives us a lot better ability to tune the experience at the user interface level and at the query level. And so when you do that, and then you have a subject hierarchy, so at the individual content level, any term gets its three structures. You have subject classification. Then we also, as you talked about in numerous talks today, wanted to present topical orientation, because for people who are not necessarily as familiar with the content, they actually need entry points. They need orientation. And we didn't want to lump all of that into the same taxonomy, because the subjects were about the specific things that individual items were about. Individual articles, individual photographs or audio or whatever it is, and whatever your content base is. At the same time, topics are more about where your site is and the expectations that sit and surround the sites that you're creating and presenting out to your users. And so what we did is created two separate structures, but then mapped it so every topic got a cluster of subjects that associate with it, which was a way of being able to then, to really be able to generate both flexibility in retrieval and generating a list. It helps the curators and editors actually assign content to topics where they need to, because the first pass of that is done by their subject classification of individual items of content. There's also a really cool bonus that comes out of that. How many of us have gone to sites and say, here's this list of all the content that I can look at. What order is that in? And usually it's in database ID order, or it's in date order, or it's in alphabetical title order. Well, when every item of content has a hierarchy of importance and relevance in its subject classification, and it has mappings to the overarching topics that relate to the site, that gives you a lot of algorithmic power to actually rate and rank lists that you present. And so, for example, if somebody is on an individual article and selects an individual topic term or an individual keyword from that article, they get put into the list page. And by being put into the list page, they're put into a list page that's ranked in order of relationship to other content around that same term. And so we can use an individual term and still build a ranking relationship out of it. This has been a cool bonus. Another thing that we've been doing, again, just sort of giving you a landscape here, another thing that we've been doing is looking at a lot of content that has no metadata or very little metadata. Now you find more of that, again, inside of enterprises than you do in content that was designed and classified specifically for going out to public in research environments. But there's a lot of content out there that has no metadata. And going back, one area where we're doing this at the moment is in a pharma company, looking at the medical environment there, and they're never going to go back and classify 15 years of PowerPoints and meeting minutes and research reports and FDA filings and all of that stuff. It's just not going to happen. And so what we've been looking at is how can we create wrappers around the content based on what we know to get people into a neighborhood. So do we know who created it, who was involved with it? Do we know when it happened? Do we know where it happened and why? So what project was this person working on when they created it, and which meeting was it in, and where did it show up as part of a set of meeting minutes that might echo back to the decisions that were made about it? And so by creating these wrappers of things that we know generally about the environment, we're able to actually begin to say, okay, there's a body of material around this topical subject that fits that period of time or that group of people or that cell line or that treatment area or whatever it is that we want to do, and without having to actually touch the individual documents. We do it by the context in the organization. So it's something else to think about where you've got a large body of material. I think we're going to see it in archives more and more because there's so much digitized content that is just almost impossible to catalog at an individual level. So using things like archival hierarchy and finding aids and broader contextual information, we can begin wrapping that context around the individual objects themselves. All right, let's take this one home. There's an article down on the bottom there, came out of work did a number of years ago, where I started thinking about how do we know how people use search results, and decided in the architecture that when somebody selects, and in this case it was a scientific environment, they could select an article for later review, they could select an article and open it up and look at it. They may then review it in detail and decide to save it to a project area that they work in, and they might eventually then write another paper that references it, or write some, research report for internal consumption or whatever. So we had built the surrounding environment and included a fairly rich annotation system for people to do that. I thought, why don't we use the annotation module to capture the selection? Because then we can capture the query that they made, we can capture the nature of the results and what filters had been applied, and whether they just selected it or whether they then looked at it or whether they used it and cited it, etc. And so we actually built the simple act of selection as an annotation. And by doing that, we could then couple it with all the other places people made annotations, and that allowed us to then look at the way content was used, and that we could begin applying that back into an organizational governance process around content development. So think about how you track selections as more than just, an action. Think about what information you're capturing at the time. And lastly, as you do that, you begin to build these iterative feedback loops. And one of our goals in doing a lot of these things is say, how can we proactively anticipate in working environments what people might need and begin to bring certain relevant things to them without them asking for it? Because what you have in expert environments is very often a situation where people are so deeply invested in the subject, they know things. But when they know things, if the environment is changing, they may not go look up whether there's new information they don't know about. And so we have to begin to think about proactive delivery of information, and the way we do that is by knowing enough about how they use it. So that's it. A toolkit of stuff to go talk with other people about.